All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to present some of my research. Very excited, particularly in a crowd of people who are excited about things such as inferentialism. So very happy to be doing this, and I appreciate the opportunity. All right. So the basic argumentative thread I'm going to be proposing today, I'm going to highlight some of the insights from Brandam's two-ply theory of perception. So Brandam argues that perceptual judgments involve two distinct capacities, the causal capacity to be behaviorally responsive to the world, and then the rational capacity to take a place in the game of giving and asking for reasons. So I'm going to highlight those two capacities and what they attempt to explain and how they explain those things pretty well. But then I'm going to offer some external motivation for why we might want to revise that two-ply theory of perception in light of certain theorists such as Chandra Kelly and Samantha Mathern, who argue for sort of non-propositional embodied normativity using the work of the philosopher Merleau-Ponty. So what I'm going to argue is that what they contend for, what they kind of explicate, is a kind of perceptual capacity that doesn't seem to be either causal or rational, and so wouldn't quite fit within the two-ply theory. Then, in case that's not terribly motivating, I'm going to try to use that discussion to frame an interpretation of the 8th chapter in Brandam's A Spirit of Trust, where he talks about desire and recognition. I'm going to try to indicate that I think there might be an internal incongruity between the two-ply theory of perception and desire and recognition. And with the goal then leading to the conclusion that a three-ply theory of perception might be in order. So that's the argument thread I'll be trying to pursue. Let me quickly turn on my own little timer here so I can keep track. Perfect. Okay. So to begin with, I think it's important to get on the table what I mean by a perceptual judgment, just in case it's not quite clear. So what I mean by it is a propositionally articulable belief formed in response to a perceptual uptake. So in response to perceiving some kind of thing through one of the senses, you form a conclusion that is in some way rationally connected to what you see. And the debates surrounding these kind of discussions, and then it then comes down to what kind of capacities are at work to make that perceptual judgment possible. Another thing that's worthy to get on the table is the notion of concept that's going to be at work here. So Rouse has a really insightful essay where he kind of parses out some of the discussion about in philosophy of perception, where what do we mean when we say concept? So he describes some people that go about a descriptive route, which is kind of your standard concept corresponding to something in the world, some token, some kind of mental object. But you also have the normative route, which is understanding concept in terms of these assessment conditions. So concept being some kind of node within a system of rules for how to use and apply that thing. And that's the kind of concept we'll be dealing with today. So not as much the descriptive one, but this kind of normative one of how something becomes embedded within a system of interactions. And particularly for Brandam, Brandam's two-ply theory perception is built on the concept being a node within a set of inferential connections, entitlements, entailments, and compatibilities. So a concept is a node within a system, that kind of system of interactions of inferential relationships. All right, so let's move now to his two-ply theory of perception now. So the first capacity that Brandam says is at work in perception is a causal capacity. This is a capacity to reliably discriminate behaviorally between different sorts of stimuli. So kind of moving directly into an example, a doorbell is a pretty simple device. It behaviorally categorizes certain weight thresholds. So once it hits a certain weight threshold, it'll ring. Anything beneath that threshold, it will remain silent. So there's just a kind of a basic responsiveness to a weight threshold mark. What we can say from that with the causal capacity is that just represents a naturalistic and physicalist vocabulary where in order to describe why that behavior happens, what impels that behavior, really the only vocabulary you need is a vocabulary of causal relationships. This device has certain kinds of features that when pressed upon, make it go. You don't need any kind of additional language to make sense of that behavior. And Brandam's going to say that this causal capacity is at work in devices sentient creatures and sapient creatures. It's kind of like a shared capacity. But then there's also the rational capacity, which is the capacity to take up a position in the game of giving and asking for reasons. So this is the kind of perceptual capacity that you, in order to explain it, you need something more than a is the case kind of vocabulary. This is going to track a normative dimension of relationships. And so importantly, going back to his notion of concepts are those things that are inferentially embedded within a linguistic system, a language system. So utterances have their meaning in virtue of these relationships, and these utterances have their meaning instituted through practical attitudes of the community as they make each other responsible to these kinds of conditions for uttering things. And so that kind of explains that there. So in order to explain this kind of capacity, one needs a normative dimension of tracking how one is responsibly or irresponsibly using certain utterances. So I'll give an example here, again, using the doorbell example. So take the first capacity again. Doorbell has certain weight thresholds. If you press it, it'll make a sound. If it's certain that don't meet the threshold, you won't make a sound. Now picture that in a scenario where there's a dinner party going on, and you're hosting it in 6 p.m. and you've invited people for a 6 p.m. dinner party, and it's just turned 5:55. The doorbell exercises its causal capacity to make a sound, and the dinner host hears that sound and forms the judgment that a guest is here. Now it's of course true that doorbell, the sound, the ringing of a doorbell doesn't intrinsically carry the value that a guest is at the door, but given the connections that you can probably, given the web of relationships that go on in such a situation, such as like you planned a dinner party for 6, it's 5:55. Doorbells typically indicate that someone's there. What kind of person would be there? It would be a guest that you probably invited. So all these kinds of these meanings that would go on in that kind of scenario work together to form the commitment that for the host that someone's at the door. So this seems to track a clear difference between what impels the behavior, what impels the doxastic commitment in the case of the rational capacity. The causal capacity is a mere responsiveness. The rational capacity requires a bit more of a normative discussion, a normative dimension to make sense of it. And importantly, what I need to highlight for the purpose of my talk is how for the causal capacity, it's going to be a non-linguistic mode of primordial engagement. It prefigures rational vocabulary because it's the device or creature's way of first getting a hold on the world. But then I kind of put in the figure of this is just a creature blue getting a hold behaviorally on the world of the stimuli in pink. The rational capacity develops upon this non-linguistic mode through, as Branham argues with Sellers, a linguistic mastery. So as we have tokens, so as we have some kind of practical classification, let's say we have a community of practical classifiers here. When linguistic utterances are introduced, we have the ability to then form tokens that are then embedded within a system of utterances. So I kind of want to emphasize here is this isn't like the token isn't completely divorced from, but is a further participation in one's behavioral activities. So you can then become further aware of how those activities are entitled with the connections to other kinds of behaviors. So you have tokens that we can then, when language is introduced, we can form attitudes towards when it is appropriate or inappropriate to use those kinds of utterances. So this, for Branham, I think, is where the normativity is introduced. The causal capacity, you just get the causal vocabulary, a mere responsiveness, but the rational capacity, you get attitudes, these second order attitudes that create a system for when it is appropriate or inappropriate to utter certain things. And I think this does track some good intuitions that we should have about perception, which is what seems to be the cause of certain behaviors doesn't seem to be cause of rational behaviors. Rational behaviors seem to, in some sense, depend upon these normative attitudes that aren't tractable to merely causal vocabulary. I think that's a really good insight. I do think, however, that there may be some room for revision. So we have, and then this is where I kind of move to the theorists who work on philosophy of embodiment and normativity. So we have, what these theorists are going to argue is that we don't just have a rational structure, we actually have a motivational structure that precedes the rational structure of conceptual relationships. So we have, they're going to be talking about attitude, content, and embodied generality. And I think these kinds of notions they develop might be potentially problematic for a two-ply theory. So what Chandra-Kelly argues in building off of Merleau-Ponty is our bodily activities, they aren't just merely reflexively responding to the world, but they actually they create a motor intentional structure, a structure where that's composed not of concepts, but of bodily activities and actions that are either correct or incorrect for the relevant situation. And this is cashed out in a variety of ways, whether it's simply navigating how your body navigates spaces, how your eyes are drawn to certain lighting conditions, how perceptual constancy works with size constancy or shape constancy. All these things, our body has a way of knowing how to move itself to get the appropriate picture, or knowing how to move itself to get the kind of a more optimal perspective on a given situation, or an optimal grasp on a given object. And these are kinds of things that Sean Kelly is going to want to say is built by a structure of activities, a structure of bodily activities that would that you can then make more determinate actions, whether it's correct or incorrect, and then revise in light of such, whether it's correct or incorrect. What I want to draw here is how this could potentially mirror a sort of inferential proprieties, but at the more embodied level. So you wouldn't be concepts at your work, but it'd be these action attitudes at work, and whether or not these actions appropriately fit within the structure of the background structure of conditions for what is appropriate versus inappropriate. And here we can start maybe seeing how this could start looking like a form of normativity that precedes language. Additionally, though, Kelly makes some good, provides some good insights about bodily understanding and how that relates to reasons. Or at least I want to carry his discussion to how it relates to reasons. So for Kelly, this motor intentionality involves a kind of understanding that just is. You can't get behind these. You can't get behind these motor activities to have a second order degree of separation to know whether it's appropriate or not. It's a lived out appropriateness condition. If it's wrong, it'll revise itself after. But there's no way of getting behind it like you can with the second order engagement with the world, with language. So motives operate as a way of just impelling behavior in a normative condition without being able to get behind that behavior, which distinguishes itself from rational intentionality. Additionally, Samantha Mathern offers some really helpful insights that I think can reinforce the positive contributions of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy, particularly as they can maybe relate to the development from embodied mastery to a linguistic mastery. So Mathern argues that like Kant, who is interested in that relationship between the understanding and the intuitions, Merleau-Ponty is deeply interested in that relationship, and he thinks that the typical answer given by the Kantian tradition is problematic because that move between the causal and the rational seems like quite a big leap. How can something go from completely unstructured to structured in just from language? And so Mathern develops Merleau-Ponty's argument to a certain sort of bodily generality, where what creates the structure for our experience is first how our bodies get a grasp on the world. And this then ties to motor intentionality, where we create a system of interactions with things and objects that form correctness and incorrectness conditions that within this general picture of bodily activity, we can then get particular meanings, determinate meanings. What I think this could be pretty helpful for is then noticing how there can be a certain kind of normative, motivated capacity that guides our perception in various situations, but doesn't yet seem to be linguistic. So some key takeaways being, again, see these action proprieties that I think might be a helpful way of describing this embodied activity, this reasons and motives distinction of terms of what kind of relationship we have to getting behind the reasons for activities. For motives, we can't get behind them. For reasons, we can because of that linguistic degree of separation. And then finally, with Mathern's work, I think she develops a good story for how we can talk about non-linguistic general categories for normative perception, where our bodies and the habits that we are involved in create this kind of transcendental condition. So it's no longer these principles, these conceptual principles, but bodily activities that make the conditions possible for experience. So I think these things are quite interesting and quite motivating for me, but I don't think they're fully motivating for the Brandom scholar quite yet. But let me kind of first lay that out. So we have what I think the problem to be. On the left, we have a non-linguistic, but also non-normative vocabulary. That doesn't seem to fit for what we've been talking about, because what we've been talking about is supposed to be normative. On the right, we have a normative, but only parsed out in terms of linguistic mastery category. That also doesn't seem to fit. So I want to say that at least if you are in any way kind of motivated by this embodied normativity, you're going to be maybe a little bit skeptical of the Two-Ply theory, not because it's completely wrong, but because it needs an additional ply. But again, I'm not sure that the Brandom scholar would be super interested in that conversation because they might not be fully compelled by embodied normativity. So what I want to then say is maybe that there's internal reason for wanting to move to a third ply. So motivational capacity, I want to use that as a lens for understanding desire and recognition in the spirit of trust. And I want to see if there's a little bit of a conflict between desire and recognition as these normative features of a creature and a Two-Ply theory of perception. So there's three basic modes of grasping in this chapter 8 of Spirit of Trust, the movement from a causal to the rational capacities of being a discursive agent. And that's the first, begins with a practical classification, an organism that takes or treats some particular as being a general kind by responding it to one way rather than another. This capacity looks a lot like the capacity involved with the first ply, the causal capacity. So I won't remark too much about that. But then it builds into a classification called desire. This one aims towards vitality. So what's interesting about this one is how an organism practical classifications move to a directedness towards metabolic needs. These could be hunger, this could be surviving predation, reproduction, all these kinds of features. The organism is going to be impelled not just from mere responsiveness, but towards metabolic needs. This has a triadic structure. So it's going to involve an impelling attitude towards a certain metabolic need, a significance that is instituted in virtue of these desiring activities of treating things as metabolic needs, or the satisfaction of metabolic needs, and then finally the act of treating something as a metabolic need. And so Brandon gives a good example of of hunger, food, and eating. Hunger represents the attitude. Food represents how something matches up within a structure of desiring activities for how these creatures treat something as food. And eating is the practical act of claiming something as food. What's really interesting about this is how it then inaugurates an objective appropriateness versus subjective appropriateness. So if a creature treats something, some red shiny thing, as food, so it has an attitude of hunger, think that thing is food and practically claims it as food by eating it, but it is not satisfied, then that was merely a subjective that was merely subjectively appropriate. It was not actually, didn't actually satisfy their desiring attitude. But if it did satisfy their food, then it was objectively appropriate. What we have here is learning as a result of experience, with which Random says as well. And what I think is interesting about this design activity is how complex these kinds of behaviors could develop, or what kind of complexity these kind of behaviors could develop into. There's all kinds of unique reproductive activities. There's all kinds of unique keeping yourself safe from predators activities, and even finding food activities that require a good deal of sensitivity to the environment, of tracking the attitudes of other creatures, of projecting these attitudes. So what I think lead up to is a pretty structured, a system of structured activities that mirrors that of what we've learned from the embodied camp, of how we can have these desiring activities that permeate our actions, but we can't get behind them, but they're still normatively conditioned. They have assessment conditions that we just live out. And finally, recognition is when desiring subjects treat each other as desiring subjects, so as to have practical engagements that license each other for licensing each other's actions as licensing their own. Sorry, I said that kind of confusingly. So a good example of this is if I see some other desiring subject taking something as an apple, or taking something as a food, a red shiny thing as food, I might then treat that action as entitling my own, or licensing my own, claiming that as an apple. That, I think, requires less discussion in terms of what I'm going to be getting at with normative conditions, because it seems pretty, at the face of it, pretty normative already, with how there's conditions of authority and responsibility, where in order for this to work, you have to see oneself as bound by the same kinds of norms, which is a very, which seems to have some kind of structured significance, a system of relations that have appropriate or inappropriate conditions. And these are supposed to be told to develop on top of each other. So going back to my discussion here, we have practical classifications, and I'm going back to discussion where see if these can fit within the Two-Ply theory of perception. We have practical classifications which I think can potentially fit within it pretty nicely. We have non-propositional, not relevantly described with normative vocabulary. You can put that under the first causal capacity. Desire, however, I think it's a little bit more tricky, because you have norm-governed directness and sensitivity to life. You have action, attitudes, dispositions that have significance in virtue of network of vitality, considerations, and habits. And this is all in a distinctive way of appearing to the organism. So these are parsed out in terms of species-specific or even creature-specific ways of inhabiting an environment. And so you get more and more away from a mere responsiveness to a more of a sensitivity to how norms could work for that creature and then their pursuit of metabolic needs. So and this of course isn't linguistic, but I want to say it looks very normative to me. So I'm not sure this would quite fit in the Two-Ply capacity. And finally, recognition, I think, is an even clearer indication of a normative feature of an organism's life that doesn't seem to fit, because it involves such a social habituation where you have interpersonal monitoring with reference to norms of authority and responsibility. You have these relationships, these interpersonal relationships, and Brandom also calls it a primitive normativity, which means in some sense it's normative and its content imbuing in virtue of some structure of relationships. So I want to say this also doesn't seem to quite fit within a Two-Ply theory of perception. And the thrust of that then, and kind of wrapping up my talk here, is I want to say that maybe we should add an additional ply in this Three-Ply theory of perception. We can have a standard-ish kind. I think there might be some potential problems with the causal capacity understanding if it's not adequately social. But we have the causal capacity. Then we would have insights from the non-propositional camp with discussions of desire and recognition from a spirit of trust to lead to a structured action embodied mastery mode of perception, of normative perception that structures one's existence which then sets up rather nicely for how language can have that immediate place in a structured world, where how language itself doesn't make possible all the kind of structured activities of normativity, but builds on it because it's already its grounding is in the bodily normativity of creatures and their pursuit for metabolic needs. We have structured concepts and embodied mastery to linguistic mastery. And I think this tells a story that can incorporate insights from embodied normativity and random discussion in the spirit of trust. So wrapping up, I like this. I like this account of Brandom, and because I like its refusal to subsume perception under a completely singular category of conceptual. I like the nuances to it, how there's multiple vocabularies for describing capacities. I just want to build on it to say there's so much complexity to organisms' pursuit of metabolic needs that I'm fearful of not treating those things as normative. And so, but I want to have the language for when we get to conceptual understanding, and then when we get to just kind of bodily normativity, I want to make space for all those kinds of things. And I think this 3-ply theory might be able to do so. Finally, there's potential objections, of course. So the desire, one might say, is perfectly suitable for a purely causal capacity. I'm just a little bit skeptical of that, just because I think when the pursuit of metabolic needs is a pretty nuanced business that involves the coming together of like the body itself doesn't regulate itself in any kind of individual way. Chemical messengers are going to incorporate social needs, environmental features, and in a way that doesn't seem to be purely responsive, but pretty sensitive to conditions necessary for life. So I'm a little bit skeptical of that move. And I still think we'd have the problem of how to locate recognition within either the causal or the rational capacity, because that seems pretty uniquely normative while not being linguistic yet. Finally, I think we have an interesting objection maybe with Matthew Boyle's additive versus transformative rationality, and Stephen Levine has already applied this to Brandom's philosophy. And if Brandom's philosophy has that problem, mine has it additionally, because I'm not just having 2 plies, I'm adding a third. But I think that this, and I think someone's presenting on this tomorrow, and so I'm looking forward to their talk, but I think that move to an additive and transformative dichotomy is actually a little bit too quick. So I don't see a problem of being additive rationalities being in some sense becoming transformative, so we can still keep that kind of distinction between the different levels of perception. All right, so I think I'm pretty much at the time of my talk, so I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments as I refine these ideas. So thank you everybody for your time.
Okay, thanks, Jag. So I'm going to sit up in front of the laptop here to be able to try to moderate both Zoom and in person, and we'll just see how this goes. So I would ask the folks on Zoom if you could, there's a hand raising function, you could try that. I've also seen people, including just in the queue, just using Q. So actually, maybe for those that are on Zoom, just enter Q in the chat, and then that'll indicate that you've got a question, and I'll keep track of that as well. So, floor is open. Okay, so Jaco, please.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me, I hope.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, let me start by saying that that was massively interesting and very relevant also to my interests that have to do with Brandom. In fact, I happen to be working on a critical argument that has to do precisely with the triadic structure of orectic awareness that you talked about under the heading of desire. So my question, I had a lot of questions, but the sort of most important point I think here is that in my reading, I think that how Brandom treats desire in Spirit of Trust is that he sees it as only explained, or in principle, it can be explained only by causal and dispositional vocabulary. So what he calls the triadic structure of orectic awareness for example, eating behavior. It differs in important respects from simple causal behavior like iron rusting in wet environments. But still, it's not different in the categorical sense that we would have to postulate something else than causal and dispositional vocabulary. For example, we have to take account of the history of the organism to explain why it behaves in a certain way. But still, it's causal disposition, basically. So there's no genuine normativity there. And the normativity comes into the picture only when you apply the TSOA, the triadic structure of archetypic awareness, in second order. So that's when you get to specific recognition of taking something as a caretaker, as Brandon puts it. So my question to you would be then, so do you accept this reading of Brandon that there is no genuine normativity at the sort of first order desire level? Or do you wish to challenge him that he has to sort of posit some sort of, as you put it, non-propositional normativity there?
Yeah, no, I think I accept the reading, and it's a move that I'm thinking through, because it's a very Kantian move in terms of you look at it's a very like you project the purposiveness rather than it being itself purposive. And so where I think I'm trying to get at here is bringing together motivations both from why we would want to treat those things as genuinely normative because of how they can structure an organism and lead an organism's or like metabolic needs, and so combine that with some contemporary theorists, and then look at it from the metabolic side of things of how those metabolic pursuits are very sensitive to features that, like, the more and more you add on to how organisms navigate their environment, it seems like the use of causal language seems to become less and less interesting, at least for me. So for me, it's kind of like, and it's by no means a knockdown argument. It's more of like a, if we look at these intuitions governing embodied normativity, and we look at how nuanced and complex an organism has to be to navigate metabolic needs, I think that the TSOA helps us rationally grasp those things, but that doesn't mean the normativity just emerges from that rational reflection. I think it just captures what is already normative going on in the organism at a more elevated understanding. But I think you're right in the sense of there is probably a potential route for Brandon out of a revision, but I'm just wondering how convincing does that become when these activities seem so structured and so normatively accessible, even as they like weigh and revise their activities.
Yeah, thank you, and I think you're on the right track, definitely. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, Kirill.
Hi, thanks a lot. Very important work, I think. So I was wondering in what sense motives are something that I can't get behind. It seems to me that having a motive is exactly what it means to be behind. So Freud's too has something like this picture in which desires outrun reasons, but psychoanalysis, whatever you think about Freud's theories, is only possible because I can restructure the realm of desire through reasoning so that I now recognize what was all along motivating me. So in psychoanalysis, the point is that language restructures the unconscious, and we can see this in mundane ways, that if I'm responsive to the expensive wine, okay, that's an embodied responsiveness, but it involves my concepts of it as expensive wine. And I take it that kind of recollective responsiveness to reasons is exactly what Brandon's answer would be, not that we're always all along having this sort of jigsaw puzzle of pieces, but that my actions are open to reasoning. And Freud also has this purely causal level of unconscious below the level that's sort of the one that I bring to me in psychoanalysis, but it's hard to gerrymander. So I was sort of wondering how you saw the lower Two-Plys interfacing.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and So I'm going to answer in a way, and let me know if I answer it correctly. So to begin with the relation between motives and reasons, I think that's precisely right in terms of we could potentially develop the resources for getting behind our motives, but the motives in and of themselves, without the linguistic enterprise to make that rational recollection possible, those motives are going to stay kind of more just immediately impelling rather than recollective. And so that's why I understand the relation between motives and reasons, and which also gets into that relation between additive and transformative rationality, where I think the rational capacity can make the motives a part of a rational system through the linguistic mastery that you get discussed classically in Brandam's thought. And in terms of the relation between causal and motivational capacity, those plies, I think that's one of those relationships. I still think it's quite troublesome for really anybody to kind of talk about the where normativity comes from itself. And so probably the best route is just that kind of biological metabolic path, which is why I think Brandam leans into in chapter 8 of A Spirit of Trust, because I do think if there is a path to take, probably the pursuit of metabolic needs for why that would then develop into some normative constraints on desiring activities. I think that is probably the best route, which is why, which I also find interesting. So does that get at the questions you were interested in?
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a great question. I don't quite hear anything yet. I still don't hear anything, unfortunately.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I hear movement. Yep.
Oh, okay, great. So I have a question about what this middle kind of normativity or this middle layer is supposed to be in normative terms, because I'm thinking that at least for Brandam, the crucial point about normativity seems to be that it's spelled out in terms of commitments and entitlements, and those are then tied up with reasons that you can give for things, reasons for showing your entitlement. And with the embodied things, I'm not really sure. Can you explain what the relevant entitlements and commitments are, and how I would give reasons for those entitlements, or how I would commit me to anything in terms of these embodied cognition or embodied motor schemas, whatever you want to draw out of Merleau-Ponty at this point?
Yeah, great question. So the way I see it working is, so the motivational capacity is going to have, and I haven't spelled this out completely, so this is very much a work in progress. So the motivational capacity relationship to the rational capacity, I'm not sure that there's going to be a direct, like, one's motives can entitle one to a doxastic commitment, because like you're saying, that involves kind of like those belief relationships in a system of utterances and entitlements. But what I want to say is, in order for the rational capacity to get off the ground, one needs a structured existence in terms of this motivated normativity, where one has a grasp of the world through the pursuit of metabolic needs and through these embodied activities that, in virtue of the activities that happen, structure significance for that creature. And how that would then relate to the rational capacity is through linguistic mastery, latching onto these motives, one can then become doxastically aware and inferentially aware of the various connections that would be involved in that motive. And so it's almost as if like how Brandam understands the relationship between rational and causal capacity. I want to say, well, before that, in terms of latching on to linguistic mastery of these practical classification skills, I want to say that what actually occurs needs to be a relation between a motivated kind of bodily way of understanding the world, which then can then be linguistically mastered through a system of a linguistic system. So I'm trying to bring together Brandam and embodied normativity, which is, like you said, but it can be a dangerous task. But I think that there's the proprieties that we get at the inferential level, we also get not in terms of inferences, but we get in terms of proprieties of action correctness at the embodied level, which is where I think we can get some interesting discussion of like what we can explain with that.
Great, thanks. Just to, sorry, if I can, one brief follow-up, just to make sure that I get it. So what you're saying is that they are, the embodied things are necessary conditions for having the inferential level, the fully rational level, but you probably want to say more because the merely causal is also a necessary condition. And I take it that that's the point where you talk about the correctness at the motor level, right? That you want to have some notion of correctness at the motor level that is not at the inferential level, but still normative in some sense. Is that the view? Is that?
Yep, I think so. I think so.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question.
So then if there's no other questions at the moment, let me ask, I think it's a similar kind of issue that Ulf raised. So I was trying to think what is involved in thinking that motivation plays a role in perception like this. And originally I was coming at it from a kind of Kantian view where I thought, well, look, why can't we just think that causes can motivate us, but then we're rational beings, so reasons can also motivate us. So motivation is kind of, it's a sort of a polarity that causes and reasons can have in different situations. And then it seems to me that a key part of your story is this idea of embodiment as a part of perceptual thing. And then I'm left just wondering what it means to say that my motivations can play a role in perception. I mean, I can be hungry, and as a result of the fact that I'm hungry, I can go look for food, and then I can see something that is food, that my motivation, but then it's played a kind of causal role. And insofar as I'm perceptually responding to something as food, you know, I can smell it. And maybe the fact that I'm hungry doesn't necessarily, I mean, that's not a necessary condition for me recognizing something as food, because I can smell it and have that kind of response. So how does motivation play this role in perception, or what role does it play?
That's yeah, and I think where the initial impelling towards food can only get off the ground when the creature has a certain kind of fluidity in its environment to make that acquisition possible. And I think that's where motives come in, where desiring comes in, where it's one thing to have the attitude, it's one thing to be able to navigate an environment, a complex environment, in a way that is sensitive. So I think the basic idea I'm trying to get at is causality cannot describe the fine-grained normative conditions that lead bodies to act. There's going to be this dynamic interplay between bodies and things in situations, whether it's like I said with like a color, like as little as like color conditions, or of how we use our motor skills to operate objects, or how we use our motor skills to navigate landscapes, how we use our motor, how we go about normatively to assess predator threats, all these things. I think the causal capacity only gets us so far, because it doesn't tell us how those kind of normative conditions are wrought out, where the motivational capacity can maybe tell a more fine-grained story of how organisms go about navigating in complex ways.
Yeah, Hillary.
Thanks a lot. So I wanted to ask you about the very first stage of your account in which you're following Brandom, describing the causal in ways that distance it from the normative. And I wondered if the way you and Brandom describe that doesn't unnecessarily separate the natural from the normative. So consider a simple measuring device like the thermostat in my house, which measures the ambient temperature in order to control the furnace. And think about an occasion like what happened recently when it broke in a way that just kept the furnace on all the time, no matter, we set the temperature, right? And just kept getting warmer and warmer in the house because, yeah. Now, you could describe that at a physical level where, say there's some wire broken inside, where you just you know, describe it in ways which show that, of course, the furnace is going to be on all the time. But if you do that, you're missing out on something, namely the way in which it's malfunctioning, the way in which it's actually representing the temperature and misrepresenting it. And talk about function is certainly not something which need be distant from the naturalistic description of it any more than in biology we need to think that as soon as we talk about function, we're not giving a naturalistic description of the biological world. And if you do that, then you can get representation and misrepresentation. You can get both ought and is. And now it doesn't look as if, I mean, I wonder if you think thinking about things in these terms ends up being some kind of three-level view like yours, or whether this suggests a way in which even the two-level view is not quite getting things right, not doing justice to the causal level or the naturalistic level of what's actually going on out there.
I really appreciate that question. That's a really good question. And my immediate response is, so I really appreciate the insight there about how these simple devices seem to participate in some kind of normative assessments of, like, for instance, like constantly heating, and that's not what there's some kind of misrepresenting of what's going on in the environment. And so even at this causal device, this simple causal device, I think what I would want to say though is, the terms of how these normative assessments are wrought out, we would only be able to normatively assess a misrepresentation. That's actually interesting, because then what I was going to say is we would only be able to assess this misrepresentation in terms of like this act of heating a room and whether or not this device is adequately characterizing the heat of the room, in terms of what does a disruption mean for us, which would involve like the levels of heat we experience in the home, which would then we would experience the disruption at a embodied level, which then we can then rationally recollect and like formulate into more like inferential level, given as we understand thermostats and their needs and all those things. But I think that doesn't actually answer your question fully, because there's the misrepresentation just seems to be of like the natural world. Like it's literally not adequately characterizing the heat in the room. So I'd have to actually think about that. I think it's a really good question that unfortunately I don't have a good answer to at the moment.
Okay, well, we are a little over time, but we started a little late, so I think that's okay. So let's thank Jag, and then we'll take a 5-minute break. Start at 11:25. Okay, so we'll start our second session now. We've got Alan Mcdonald, who will be presenting remotely on Power Score and the post-Brandom game. Alan, if you're ready, you can take it away.